Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and my rant for you today is about the criminal justice system. And this really falls under the umbrella of authoritarianism that I've been ranting about in my video on religion and my video on education. And today I'm going to talk about the criminal justice system, but it falls under this umbrella of it's really a cultural burden that says we are innately bad at our core and we need to be controlled and forced through shame and punishment and fear and manipulated into being good. And that people have authority over us and they are sanctioned to use the shame and punishment to get us to do the right thing. That's essentially authoritarianism, but it shows up in parenting, religion, education, criminal justice system, government, medicine, everything. And I really want to expose how it's not only ineffective, it often causes the very thing that it's trying or says it's trying to rid the society of. Because if you go back and watch my video on the shame cycle, it's actually shame and the belief that we are bad at our core that causes us to create these extreme protective parts that often are antisocial and lash out at other people. So it's really fueling the very thing that it's then shaming and punishing. And it becomes this vicious cycle. And it's so clear to see this in the criminal justice system. So a little history about me. When I was in college, I was, as my friends without houses would say, I was a do-gooder. I went to a small college and I got about 200 of the students to give up their lunches on Fridays. Their parents were likely paying for their meal plan, but they would not eat on Fridays. And then a group of us would go and we would pack sack lunches and bring about 200 lunches to downtown Riverside, where there was a big homeless population. And through that, I got to know many people who lived on the streets and learned about their histories, their mental health struggles, the firefighters and addictive parts that they used to help numb their pain, the struggles they went through. And they were often, sometimes we would come to the park and many of my friends would not be there. And I would find out that they were taken, to prison. And another thing that I loved that I did in college was every week I would go to the local juvenile hall and I would basically just sit and talk. The one that I went to was a boys' juvenile hall. And I would just talk to the boys about their lives, currently in the system, before that, their hopes and dreams for after that. And it was fascinating to me. I got a up close and personal look at the people in the system and how the system was run. And it was so sad to me because not only do you have these kids who have terrible experiences, lives, at home with parents who are addicted to drugs and who are beating them, abusing them in lots of different ways, poverty, all kinds of trauma experiences. And so, of course, then they develop these big protective parts against the world. And then those are seen as evil and bad. So now they're locked up and they experience more trauma. They're re-traumatized. Now they have these guards and these people over them that are bullying them, beating them up, often shaming them, treating them like animals. And then you have these kids that are comparing stories. And it's no wonder that they get out and they come right back in, right? Because there's no focus on the roots, on healing the root issues. It's just, we're going to try to beat it out of you, make you so afraid to do these things. But as we know in IFS, our firefighters and all of our extreme parts cannot stop doing what they're doing until what they protect is healed. And the system very rarely focuses on healing or even finding out what the root issues are. And here I was, a college student, just going and hanging out and listening to them, and it was apparent to me. And then it was frustrating because I was a psychology major and I took a class called Juvenile Delinquency with a professor that was in his 70s, and this old textbook. And I would read it, and it was so out of touch with what I was experiencing every week going into juvie. And I would ask the professor about it. And I would say, have you ever been into a juvenile hall? Or when was the last time you've been to a juvenile hall? And he said, oh, I've never actually been in one. And here he is training the future generations that are going to make policy or run this system, and he's never experienced it. I just remember feeling so incredibly frustrated. And that was when, many years ago now, when I realized we have to shift from punitive justice to restorative justice, not just for the humanity and the sake of the people in the prison system, but for the sake of all of us at large, because don't we want to do something that's actually effective, that actually helps people, right? So recently, one of the people in my Tuesday IFS community that I facilitate, shout out to Suzanne, recommended a TED Talk by a woman named Susan Olasek. And Susan created this nonprofit where she goes into prisons and she teaches inmates about the Enneagram, which is a personality typing system, but also really a self-development type of program. And she found that people were actually really receptive to learning about themselves and basically about their protective system and what had happened to them and how that developed. And so she began to realize that every single inmate that she interacted with had experienced significant trauma and attachment wounding. And so she began to use the Enneagram and trauma healing techniques like IFS. And she began to see transformation in these people, and it was amazing. She talks about how she went to one women's prison that 100% of the women inmates had experienced rape, many of them before they were 12 years old. And in the men's prisons, I can't remember the number, but a majority of the men had lost their fathers to prison, abandonment, death before their teenage years. And both men and women had experienced significant abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse in their developmental years. So it's no wonder that they had developed these big firefighter parts, these raging perpetrator parts, right? To try to protect them, to diligently protect them in the world. And so here's our most vulnerable population who are doing everything to try to protect themselves. But instead of being given love and nurturing and teaching of the skills that they didn't get from their own parents, we are re-traumatizing them by punishing them, putting them in isolation, exposing them to all kinds of terrible things. So again, it's no wonder that the recidivism rate, it's hard to say, I believe is 68%. You can check it. It's in Susan Olasek's TED Talk, but a very, very high percent of people who come back into prisons. So, I mean, the prison system is not effective, right, in actually creating a safe society. And I can't, again, I might be wrong with the number, but something like incarceration has gone up something like 400% in the last few years, right? So it's not just that, to me, it produces more harm than good. It's not effective in creating a safer environment for the society at large. So what would be effective? So I'll tell you what I think. So I encourage you to think about the society. We talk about internal family systems, right? So we have this inner system inside of us, and it's reflected by like the system outside of us, the family system, the cultural system of our society, right? And so if you think about the people who are being put into prisons, they're kind of like the antisocial, really they're being dominated by their firefighter parts, right? Those are the parts that are coming out in front the most for them. So if you think about your internal family system and how we deal with firefighters in our system, right? Sometimes if they're big and they're harmful and other parts of us are afraid of them or being harmed by them, we might put them in a room with a one-way mirror so that the other parts can feel safe. We create a little bit of distance, but then the self can observe and try to get curious and say, what happened to you? And how did you learn this? And the self knows that even parts who are acting out in really big ways have a story, that they're doing it for a reason, that there are more vulnerable parts that they're protecting. And if we can get to them and we can heal them, then they will no longer have to do this big job they're doing, right? So that's the same thing that I would kind of suggest. I'm not saying get rid of prisons altogether. If a person is blended with protective parts that are harmful to other people, because essentially, especially our big firefighter parts that are antisocial, their number one intention is to protect the individual. They don't care that they're harming people outside of that. And sometimes they're even harming the individual in the process of ultimately trying to save them. So they can very realistically be doing harmful things, but they have a good intention that we need to look for. So setting them aside, creating distance, I'm not opposed to that. It's what we do when we set them aside. In the current system, for the most part, there's just isolation and trying to control and rally people like animals and punish them. And there's stigma and shame, right? But what if instead we put them in an environment that was safe and healthy, right? So we're giving them a nice bed to sleep on, so that they can get good sleep. We're letting them go out in the sun so they can get vitamin D, giving them good water, nutritious food, opportunity for movement, connection, maybe giving them therapy and classes and I know there are people that go into the prisons and do these things, like teach meditation and some self-help things, like the Enneagram, doing trauma healing work. But what if that was the real focus was, how can we help you? And how can we help teach you the skills that you didn't have, right? When you think about conscious parenting, which I need to do a video about parenting, but it's really about if and when your child acts out, understanding that they are, like Dr. Becky says, they're good inside, right? They are good at their core. They're doing this harmful thing on the outside. Why? Let me get curious. What is their need? What is the skill that they need to learn? What is the emotion that they need to learn how to regulate, or what's the emotion telling us about what they need? So getting really curious about it rather than immediately going to try to suppress it, right? Which is basically, the prison system is like a huge manager that's just trying to suppress all of it. So a safe place where they're not being re-traumatized, but they're actually receiving the healthy attachment that they need. And I can see people saying, this isn't fair. You're talking about them being rewarded. They're going off to the spa, where they have good food and, all of these things. But what I would argue is yes, because that is what would help you and me and everybody, is if everyone in our society had the basic building blocks to have their needs met, to have their wounds healed, then they no longer need to do any kind of perpetrating activity, right? And they don't need to return to the prisons. We don't need to keep paying for the prisons. They're not going to be, stealing and raging or whatever in the outside. It's actually the most effective and the most beneficial to the entire society. So the last thing I'll say about this, many of you may have heard this story. I don't know specifically which tribe it is, but there's a tribe where they say, at least the story goes, that when someone perpetrates, right, they steal something, they hurt someone, they do some kind of crime in this tribe, the consequence is that they put the person in the middle of the circle and everyone surrounds them and reminds them of their goodness, tells them all the things that they love about the person, all the good things that they have done. That's how they rehabilitate them. They remind them of their goodness. And just a quick little anecdote from my life. Recently on the We Can Do Hard Things podcast with Glenn and Abby and Amanda, they interviewed Dr. Becky Kennedy, who wrote Good Inside, who uses internal family systems and parenting. And she was talking about repairing and how when we do something wrong, the art of repair. And what she kept reiterating over and over again to the three women was, you have to repair on the inside first. It's impossible to repair on the outside genuinely and effectively until you have done it on the inside first. And she said, what that looks like is when you've done something that harms, that hurts another person, you have to be able to turn inside first and say, I am good. I am good at my core. I am a good person. I did something bad, right? So this is really shifting from shame to productive guilt, right? I am good at my core. I'm a good person. I did something bad. I made a mistake. Let me go repair it. That is the foundation of our ability to go and repair, is that we have to know we're good. So just a quick example of that. Yesterday was my youngest son's 18th birthday. And the day before, my husband and I spent the whole day getting all of these fun things for him, balloons and decorations and cakes and all of these things. And then on his birthday, we went to the movies and we went out to eat and we spent the day with him. And by the end of the day, I was so tired. I went to bed and I didn't realize until the next morning, his girlfriend had texted me these pictures of him alone in the room with his birthday cake, lighting his own candles. And I thought, oh my gosh, I forgot to give him his birthday cake and sing happy birthday. And the first thing was this temptation to go into a shame spiral. And the inner critics came out and they were saying, oh, you're such a terrible mom. And then the other part saying, I can't be perfect. I tried so hard and I failed. And this shame, right? And I remembered what Dr. Kennedy said. And I stood there and I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, you're a good person. You're such a good person. You did so much to try to make your son's birthday special. You love your son. You're so good. You just forgot. You just made a mistake and you forgot. And I felt so, it's hard to explain, like supported. I felt so stable. And from that place, I could then go to my son this morning without a big fanfare of woe is me, how awful am I, I'm so sorry. Instead, just say, oh my goodness, I was so tired, I forgot to sing happy birthday to you. I'm so sorry. Can I sing it to you now? But it made me sad that I forgot, right? So I think it's the same, no matter what we've done, even if it's the most horrific perpetrator activity. If we can say, I'm good at my core, I did this thing that is out of alignment with my goodness, how can I repair it? That is the way to not only not perpetrate again, so we heal the wounds, but we also reinforce, especially to this population of people who honestly, the core wound is, I am bad, I am shameful. And when we keep reinforcing that wound, the protective parts continue to act out, right? So if instead we reinforce, no, you are good, you are lovable, you are innately lovable at your core, you did something legitimately harmful, but it's not consistent with who you are. How can we heal your wounds? And then how can you make repair for what you those protective parts have done? So the solution to me is really within internal family systems, and this understanding of our innate self, and helping especially the most vulnerable of our population that usually ends up in the prisons. And I didn't even go into detail about the corruption of the criminal justice system, how it's a money-making machine, how it targets people of color. There's so many problems with the criminal justice system. But I wanted to highlight how it's an example of authoritarianism and what it looks like to perhaps do something different. So if you have any comments, you want to add anything, or you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below.